David shivered in his taxi on a freezing Chicago night, counting the few crumpled dollars he'd earned during his 12-hour shift. Life had been tough since his wife's passing 3 years ago, and with his mother's medical bills mounting, every dollar mattered. The ancient taxi's meter had been his constant companion for 2 decades, but tonight, something different was about to unfold. When he encountered a sobbing mother clutching her sleeping child outside Children's Memorial Hospital at midnight, no one could have predicted what he would do. His decision to help her without accepting payment seemed small at the time, but within 24 hours, his phone would ring with news that would leave him stunned beyond belief. This simple act of kindness was about to change multiple lives in ways no one could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter December wind cut through David's thin jacket as he guided his worn-out Crown Victoria through Chicago's frost-glazed streets. The dashboard clock blinked 11:45 p.m., its red digits a constant reminder of another endless shift. The cab's broken heater barely pushed out warm air, forcing him to rely on the threadbare blanket he kept on the passenger seat. At 45, the lines on his face told stories of thousands of late-night fares and endless city miles. 20 years behind the wheel had taught David every shortcut in the windy city, every pothole to avoid, every traffic light's rhythm. But lately the familiar streets felt heavier with memories. He passed the diner where Anna, his late wife, used to bring him coffee during his night shifts. The coffee wasn't great, but her smile made it the best part of his evening. Now, 3 years after losing her to cancer, even the diner's neon sign seems dimmer. The unopened medical bills on his kitchen table haunted his thoughts. His mother's Parkinson's treatment wasn't getting any cheaper, and the insurance barely covered half. He'd been picking up extra shifts, sometimes working 16 hours straight, but it never seemed enough. The taxi company's owner, Mr. Chen, had been understanding, letting David work longer hours than regulations strictly allowed. "You're my most reliable driver," he'd say. But David could see the concern in the old man's eyes. Tonight had been particularly slow. A dozen short fares, a couple of tipsy college students, and one businessman who spent the entire ride arguing on his phone. David's ledger showed barely enough to cover his gas and daily cab rental, let alone add to his mother's medical fund. He'd started selling off pieces of furniture from the small apartment he'd shared with Anna, but there wasn't much left to sell. The city lights reflected off patches of ice on the sidewalks, creating an almost ethereal glow. Michigan Avenue's upscale shops had closed hours ago, their darkened windows displaying luxuries that seemed to belong to another world entirely. David remembered how Anna used to window shop here during Christmas, planning imaginary purchases, with the optimism that had defined her personality. "Someday," she'd always say, squeezing his hand. Now those dreams felt as distant as the stars hidden behind Chicago's light-polluted sky. His radio crackled occasionally with dispatcher calls, but David had almost decided to call it a night. His fingers were stiff from the cold, and the thought of his mother waiting up for him, despite his insistence that she needed rest, made him consider heading home early. She'd probably left dinner in the microwave again, though her trembling hands made cooking increasingly difficult. The streets around this time usually belonged to the night shift workers, the partygoers, and the lost souls of the city. David had learned to read people over the years, the way they carried themselves, the stories hidden behind their eyes. Every passenger brought their own world into his cab, sharing snippets of lives that intersected briefly with his own before disappearing into the urban sprawl. As he approached the familiar stretch near Children's Memorial Hospital, the same route he'd driven thousands of times before, David had no way of knowing that this ordinary night was about to become extraordinary. His next decision would set in motion a chain of events that would remind him of something he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes life's biggest changes come disguised as simple moments of humanity. Little did he know as he drove past the hospital's illuminated entrance that destiny was about to step into his taxi, wearing tears and carrying hope. The harsh fluorescent lights of Children's Memorial Hospital cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. David had just decided to take one final loop around the medical district before heading home when he saw them. Under the harsh glare of a streetlight stood a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, clutching a small child wrapped in what appeared to be a hospital blanket. Even from a distance, her distress was palpable. The woman's dark hair whipped around her face in the bitter wind, and her thin jacket offered little protection against Chicago's merciless December chill. The child in her arms, completely still, was bundled more carefully, but David could see the telltale hospital bracelet on the little one's wrist. What caught his attention most, though, was the way the woman's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling too much to dial. Something about the scene struck a deep chord within David. Perhaps it was the way the woman held her child, reminiscent of how Anna used to cradle their nephew. Or maybe it was the desperate loneliness that seemed to envelope her, a feeling he knew all too well since losing his wife. Without conscious thought, he pulled his taxi to the curb. "Do you need a ride?" He called through the passenger window, his voice gentler than his usual taxi driver's bark. The woman looked up, startled, hastily wiping tears from her face with her free hand. The streetlight illuminated dark circles under her eyes and worry lines that seemed too deep for someone her age. I can't," she stammered, shifting the sleeping child in her arms. "My phone died, and my sister isn't answering her landline. I thought I could handle the bus, but Emma's fever." Her voice cracked as she looked down at the child. "We live in Oak Park, and I only have $40 left after the prescription copy. I know it's not enough for such a long ride, but—" David noticed she was standing next to the oncology wing entrance. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just any sick child. The memories of Anna's final months flooded back. The sterile hospital corridors, the mounting bills, the crushing weight of uncertainty. "Let me help you get her into the cab," David said, already stepping out into the cold. Up close, he could see the child's pale face, partially hidden against her mother's shoulder. A knit cap covered what he suspected was a head bare of hair, and his heart constricted at the sight. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, initially hesitated, but the wind was picking up and Emma stirred restlessly in her arms. David helped them into the back seat, retrieving a clean blanket from his trunk, one of Anna's old quilts that he kept for emergencies. As he tucked it around them, Sarah's eyes welled with fresh tears. "It's been such a long day," she whispered, more to herself than to David. The doctors changed her treatment plan again. The first round didn't work like they hoped. Her voice trembled. "My husband, Michael, he used to handle all of this, the drives, the medical terms, the insurance, but since the accident last year—" She trailed off, unconsciously tightening her hold on Emma. David adjusted his rearview mirror, catching glimpses of them as he navigated through the quiet streets. Sarah spoke softly about their life, how she'd quit her job as a grief counselor to care for Emma full-time, how their savings had dwindled faster than anyone could have predicted, how some days the weight of being both mother and father felt impossible to bear. Emma stirred occasionally, murmuring in her feverish sleep. Each time, Sarah would press her lips to her daughter's forehead, checking her temperature with the instinctive gesture of a worried mother. David caught himself doing something he rarely did these days, sharing his own story. He told Sarah about Anna, about his mother's struggle with Parkinson's, about the lonely nights when the city seemed too big and too empty. The drive to Oak Park took nearly an hour with the late-night road construction. As they pulled up to a modest apartment complex, Sarah began gathering their things, her hand already reaching for her purse. David could see the crumpled bills she was counting. Probably grocery money for the week, he realized with a pang. Before she could speak, he made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. "No charge," he said firmly, turning to face her. "Just focus on taking care of your little girl." Sarah's face crumpled. "But you've come so far." "And the meter." David shook his head. "Sometimes life deals us cards we never expected to play. Tonight let someone else help carry the hand you've been dealt." Through her tears, Sarah managed to share something that would later prove significant. She still volunteered at the Thompson Children's Cancer Foundation when Emma's treatments allowed. "They do amazing work," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They help families like us navigate this impossible journey." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As David watched them disappear into the apartment building, Anna's quilt still wrapped around Emma's small shoulders, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense that maybe, just maybe, there was still meaning to be found in this vast, often cruel city. He didn't know then that this moment of kindness would soon ripple out in ways he could never have imagined. The red numbers on his meter showed a fare of $78, money he desperately needed. Yet somehow, as he pulled away from the curb, the usual weight of financial worry felt lighter, replaced by something warmer, something that reminded him of Anna's smile when she spoke about hope. The digits on David's microwave clock blinked 2:17 a.m. as he sat at his small kitchen table, mechanically counting the day's earnings. The familiar ritual felt different tonight, his thoughts continuously drifting back to Sarah and Emma. His apartment was quiet except for the occasional rumble of the L train passing nearby, its vibrations making the stack of unpaid medical bills tremble at the corner of the table. $78. That's what the unpaid fare had cost him. In his 20 years of driving, he'd never voluntarily waived a fare this large. The amount kept repeating in his mind as he sorted the crumpled bills and loose change from his shift. $78 could have covered half his mother's monthly prescription costs. It could have paid for the taxi's overdue oil change. Instead, it had vanished into the night along with a borrowed blanket, one of the few remaining pieces of Anna's he had kept. His mother's voice echoed from the small bedroom down the hall. "David, is that you?" Despite his constant reminders about not waiting up, she rarely slept until he was home safe. He could hear her shuffling towards the kitchen, her steps uncertain, accompanied by the soft tap of her cane. "You should be sleeping, Mom," he said, quickly tucking the bills into a drawer. Maria Martinez appeared in the doorway, her silver hair neatly braided for bed, her hand trembling slightly as it gripped the doorframe for support. Even in her floral nightgown and well-worn slippers, she carried herself with the dignity that had seen her through decades of cleaning other people's homes to raise him alone. "I heated up some arroz con pollo," she said, ignoring his comment about sleep. Her accent, still strong after 40 years in Chicago, became more pronounced when she was tired. "You're too thin lately, mijo." David watched as she carefully made her way to the kitchen chair, her movements painfully slow but determined. The Parkinson's had progressed rapidly in the past year, but her eyes remained sharp as ever. She studied his face with the intuition that only mothers seem to possess. "Something's troubling you," she stated, not asked. It wasn't a question. As David reheated the food, he found himself telling her about Sarah and Emma, about the hospital blanket, the child's knit cap, the mother's desperate counting of bills. His mother listened silently, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "Your father would be proud," she said finally, her voice soft. "He always said kindness matters more than money." David's throat tightened at the mention of his father, gone 25 years now. "Papa didn't have to worry about medical bills," he replied, more sharply than he intended. The guilt hit him immediately as he saw his mother's slight flinch. "I'm sorry," he added quickly. "It's just, everything keeps getting more expensive. The cab companies are raising their daily rental fees next month. Your new medication isn't covered by insurance, and now—" He gestured helplessly at the drawer where he'd hidden the bills. Maria reached across the table, her trembling hand covering his. "Do you remember what Anna always said? About how the universe has its own way of balancing things?" David did remember. It was one of Anna's favorite sayings, especially during her final months when the pain was at its worst. God never closes a door without opening a window, she would insist, even as the cancer took everything from them piece by piece. The memory of Anna, combined with the sight of Emma's pale face under the streetlight, suddenly overwhelmed him. David pushed away from the table, turning to face the small window above the sink. The city lights blurred as he blinked back unexpected tears. "I keep thinking about that little girl," he admitted. "She reminded me so much of Tommy, his nephew, Anna's sister's boy, who'd spent so many evenings with them before Anna got sick, who still asked about Uncle David, even though David rarely visited anymore, finding family gatherings too painful without Anna beside him." His mother's chair scraped against the linoleum as she stood, her movements careful but determined. She made her way to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The tremors in her touch seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the city outside. "You're Anna. She knew something that you've forgotten, mijo," Maria said softly. "She knew that sometimes the richest moments come when we have nothing left to give but kindness." David turned to help his mother back to her chair, the familiar guilt washing over him as he noticed how much more pronounced her tremors had become. The clock now showed 2:43 a.m. In less than 4 hours, he would need to start another shift. The thought of the long day ahead weighed heavily, but something about his mother's words lingered. As he finally lay in bed an hour later, David found himself thinking about Sarah's mention of the Thompson Children's Cancer Foundation. He made a mental note to look them up, wondering if they might have resources that could help her and Emma. His last conscious thought before drifting off was of Anna's quilt, hoping it would bring the same comfort to Emma that it had brought to his wife during her final days. The phone's ring pierced the darkness at 3:17 a.m., its sharp trill cutting through the ambient noise of the city night. For a moment, David considered letting it go to voicemail. Late-night calls rarely brought good news. But something made him reach for the phone, his hand guided by an instinct he couldn't explain. He couldn't have known that this call would be different, that sometimes the universe does indeed have its own way of balancing things, that sometimes a simple act of kindness can open doors we never knew existed. "Is this David Martinez, the taxi driver from tonight?" The voice on the other end was clear and professional, with an undertone of urgency that made David sit up straighter in his bed. The red numbers on his alarm clock seemed to pulse in the darkness. 3:17 a.m. "Yes, this is David," he answered, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Had Sarah forgotten something in his cab? Has something happened to Emma? The voice belonged to a woman he didn't recognize, her tone carrying the kind of authority that made his heart beat faster. "Mr. Martinez, I apologize for calling at such an hour. My name is Dr. Jennifer Thompson, founder of the Thompson Children's Cancer Foundation. I'm calling about Sarah Williams and her daughter Emma, whom you drove home earlier this evening." David switched on his bedside lamp, fully awake now. The name of the foundation triggered his memory. Sarah had mentioned it during their drive. Through his thin walls, he could hear the distant rumble of a garbage truck making its early morning rounds, a sound that usually marked the end of his night shift. "Is everything all right? Did something happen to Emma?" The concern in his voice was genuine. In the few hours since he'd left them, the image of the sleeping child wrapped in Anna's quilt had stayed with him. "Emma is stable," Dr. Thompson assured him quickly. "But something did happen tonight, Mr. Martinez. Something remarkable." She paused, and David could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Sarah called me about an hour ago. She's been one of our most dedicated volunteers, even through Emma's treatment. Tonight she told me a story about a taxi driver who showed extraordinary kindness when she needed it most." David felt his face warm. "I just did what anyone would do," he started. But Dr. Thompson interrupted him gently. "That's exactly it, Mr. Martinez, you didn't. Do you know how many people pass by those in need every day? How many times Sarah has stood outside that hospital, trying to figure out how to get her daughter home safely?" Her voice softened. "But that's not the only reason I'm calling." The sound of typing came through the line, followed by more paper shuffling. Sarah shared something else with me, about your own story, about your wife Anna and your mother's condition, about how you've been struggling to balance it all. David's throat tightened. He hadn't realized he'd shared so much during that ride. The mention of Anna's name by this stranger made his heart ache in a familiar way. Mr. Martinez. David, Dr. Thompson continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. Our foundation doesn't just help children with cancer. We believe in supporting the entire ecosystem of care around them. The parents, the families, the caregivers, and yes, even the stranger who shows kindness at midnight. Through his bedroom window, David could see the first hints of pre-dawn light touching the Chicago skyline. The city was beginning to stir, unaware that in a small apartment, one man's life was about to change dramatically. We've been developing a new initiative, Dr. Thompson explained. A comprehensive transportation program for our families. Too many of them struggle with exactly what Sarah faced tonight. Getting to and from treatments, managing emergency situations, dealing with the logistical challenges that come with long-term medical care. David listened intently, his mind already connecting the dots before Dr. Thompson could finish. 20 years of driving through these streets, of knowing every shortcut and quiet route, years of helping passengers in and out of his cab, of learning to read people's needs before they voiced them. Sarah told me about your background, 2 decades of experience, knowledge of the city, and most importantly, a heart that understands what our families are going through. Dr. Thompson's voice carried a note of excitement now. We'd like to meet with you, David. Today, if possible. What you did tonight. It wasn't just about one ride or one family. You may have inadvertently shown us exactly what we've been looking for. The garbage truck outside had moved on, leaving behind a profound silence that seemed to emphasize the weight of this moment. David's eyes fell on the framed photo of Anna on his nightstand, her smile forever frozen in happier times. I have a shift starting in a few hours, he said hesitantly, thinking of Mr. Chen and the cab company's strict policies. We'll make it worth your time, Dr. Thompson assured him. Can you come to our offices at 9 a.m.? We're located in the Mercury building downtown. She paused before adding, David, I know this call seems unusual, but sometimes the universe has a way of putting the right people in the right place at exactly the right moment. The words echoed what his mother had said earlier about Anna's belief in the universe's balance. As David wrote down the address with slightly shaking hands, he couldn't help but feel that something significant was unfolding, something bigger than a late-night fare or an act of kindness. One more thing, Dr. Dr. Thompson added just before ending the call. Sarah wanted you to know, Emma's fever broke about an hour ago. She's sleeping peacefully, still wrapped in that quilt you gave them. Sometimes, Mr. Martinez, the smallest gestures carry the greatest power. As David set down his phone, the first rays of sunrise were beginning to paint his small bedroom in shades of gold. In just a few hours, he would walk into the Mercury building, unaware that his life was about to transform in ways he never could have imagined. The morning traffic was already beginning to build outside his window, the city awakening to another ordinary day. But for David Martinez, this day would be anything but ordinary. The Mercury building stood like a gleaming sentinel in downtown Chicago's financial district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun. David had driven past it countless times, but he'd never imagined himself walking through its revolving doors. He'd called Mr. Chen at the cab company, making up an excuse about his mother's doctor appointment. The lie sat uncomfortably in his stomach as he straightened his only tie, a Christmas gift from Anna years ago. The security guard at the desk eyed his worn jacket with barely concealed skepticism, but directed him to the 42nd floor after checking his ID. As the elevator climbed, David caught glimpses of his reflection in the polished doors. The man staring back at him looked tired, older than his 45 years, with worry lines etched deeply around his eyes. Mr. Martinez? A young woman in a crisp business suit greeted him as the elevator doors opened. I'm Jessica, doctor. Thompson's assistant. Please, follow me. She led him through an office space that screamed success, all modern furniture and abstract art, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. David's shoes, polished but worn, sank into plush carpeting as they approached a large conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see several people seated around a massive table. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized Sarah among them, looking more composed than she had last night, but still holding herself with that same quiet vulnerability. David. Sarah stood as he entered, her eyes bright with emotion. I'm so glad you came. She was wearing professional attire now, a stark contrast to her appearance last night. Before he could respond, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair stepped forward, extending her hand. Dr. Jennifer Thompson, she introduced herself, her handshake firm and warm. Please, have a seat. We have much to discuss. She gestured to an empty chair, and David found himself sitting between Sarah and a distinguished-looking man who introduced himself as James Peterson, the Foundation's Chief Operations Officer. First, let me properly explain who we are, Dr. Thompson began, settling into her chair at the head of the table. The Thompson Children's Cancer Foundation isn't just a medical charity. We're an organization dedicated to transforming how families navigate the devastating journey of childhood cancer. Sarah here isn't just Emma's mother. She's also one of our most valuable team members. Sarah smiled softly. Before Emma's diagnosis, I was a grief counselor. After Michael's accident and Emma's illness, the foundation didn't just help us with medical support. They gave me purpose again. I've been helping other parents cope with their children's diagnoses, using my professional background and personal experience. David listened, still unsure why he was sitting in this impressive room, surrounded by people who clearly operated in a different world than his late-night taxi runs and careful penny pinching. What you don't know, David, Dr. Thompson continued, is that transportation has been one of our biggest challenges. We've tried various solutions, volunteer drivers, ride-share partnerships, even a small fleet of our own vehicles. But what we've lacked is someone who truly understands both the logistical and emotional aspects of what our families need. James Peterson opened a folder in front of him. Your background check came back clean. 20 years of safe driving, no accidents, excellent customer service records. Mr. Chen at your cab company spoke very highly of you when we called this morning. David's surprise must have shown on his face because Sarah reached over and touched his arm gently. Last night, when you helped us, it wasn't just about the ride, David. You showed understanding, compassion, and professionalism in a way that's rare to find. What we need, Dr. Thompson interrupted gently, is someone who understands our families because he understands struggle, someone who knows this city like the back of his hand, someone who sees people, not just passengers. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes meeting David's. Last night you did more than give us a free ride. You listened, you shared your own story. You made us feel seen during one of our darkest moments. That's exactly what our families need. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught something on Sarah's desk, a familiar pattern of fabric. Anna's quilt was folded neatly beside her, freshly laundered. Emma wouldn't let go of it all night, Sarah explained, following his gaze. She said it felt like being hugged by an angel. Dr. Thompson cleared her throat softly. We know this is a big decision. The job would require training, certification in medical transport protocols, management skills that we're prepared to help you develop. But most importantly, it requires heart. And you've already proven you have that in abundance. David looked around the table at these people who had seen something in him that he hadn't even seen in himself. His eyes lingered on Anna's quilt, remembering how she always said that closed doors lead to open windows. Perhaps this was his window. The city stretched out below them. The same streets he'd driven for 20 years now viewed from a completely different perspective. Somewhere out there, his mother was probably worried about him, and Mr. Chen was wondering about his mysterious absence. But here, in this moment, David Martinez felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. David sat in his parked taxi outside his apartment building that evening, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, though the engine had been off for several minutes. The worn leather folder from the Thompson Foundation lay on the passenger seat, containing paperwork that could completely change his life. The setting sun painted Chicago's skyline in shades of orange and pink, the same view he'd seen thousands of times, but somehow looked different today. His mother's silhouette appeared in their third-floor window, probably wondering why he hadn't come up yet. "We want to offer you a position," Dr. Thompson stated directly. "Director of Transportation Services for the Thompson Foundation. You would be responsible for developing and overseeing our entire transportation program, coordinating rides for families, training drivers and handling medical equipment, establishing protocols for emergency situations." David's mind spun as James slid a document across the table. "The position comes with a comprehensive benefits package, including full medical coverage that would extend to your mother." He pointed to a number at the bottom of the page that made David's breath catch. It was more than triple what he made in his best months driving the taxi. I don't know what to say," David managed, his voice thick with emotion. "This is incredible, but I'm just a taxi driver. Surely you need someone with management experience." The day's events played through his mind like scenes from someone else's life: the gleaming Mercury building, the impressive conference room, Dr. Thompson's offer, Sarah's grateful smile. It all felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. Finally gathering his courage, David grabbed the folder and headed upstairs. The familiar smell of his mother's cooking greeted him as he opened their apartment door. Arroz con gandules, his favorite comfort food. Maria Martinez stood at the stove, her movements slower than they used to be but still precise, a lifetime of cooking encoded in muscle memory. "Mijo," she called out, not turning around. "You missed your morning shift." Mr. Chen called twice. The concern in her voice was evident, but there was something else too. Curiosity, perhaps, or hope. David had never missed a shift without good reason in 20 years. He placed the leather folder on their small kitchen table and helped his mother to her chair before sitting down himself. Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Tell me," she said simply. As David recounted the morning's meeting, his mother's eyes filled with tears. He described the foundation's offer, the salary, the medical benefits that would cover her Parkinson's treatments. When he mentioned the quilt, Anna's quilt, and how it had comforted little Emma, Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer of thanks. "You're Anna," she said softly. She always said God works in mysterious ways. She reached across the table, her trembling hand covering his. "What did you tell them?" David took a deep breath. "I asked for 24 hours to think about it. It's such a big change, Mama. What if I'm not qualified? What if I fail?" His mother's grip tightened slightly. "Tell me again about the little girl, Emma. How did you feel when you helped them?" David closed his eyes, remembering. "Like I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Like Anna was there with me, showing me the way." The sound of children playing drifted up from the street below, their laughter carrying through the open window. Maria stood slowly, making her way to the small shelf where they kept their family photos. She returned with a faded picture, David's father in his taxi, taken the year before the accident that took him from them. "Your father drove his taxi with pride," she said, placing the photo on the table. "He always said it wasn't just about getting people from one place to another. It was about being there for them in their moments of need. Now you have a chance to do that on an even bigger scale." David picked up the photo, studying his father's smile. "But what about you, Mama? The new job will mean longer hours during training, more responsibilities." Maria laughed softly. "Mijo, I've spent 20 years worrying about you worrying about me. Maybe it's time we both stopped worrying so much and started believing in miracles again. The evening light was fading now, the kitchen growing dimmer. David got up to turn on the lights, and as the room brightened, he felt something shift inside him. He thought about all the passengers he'd driven over the years, the celebrations, the heartbreaks, the ordinary moments in between. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about other families facing similar struggles. He thought about Anna, and how she'd always encouraged him to dream bigger. Reaching for his phone, he dialed the number Dr. Thompson had given him. It rang twice before her warm voice answered. "David, I was hoping to hear from you." "I'll take the job," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "I want to help make a difference." He could hear the smile in Dr. Thompson's voice as she responded, "Welcome to the Foundation, David. We'll see you Monday morning." After hanging up, David called Mr. Chen. The old man listened quietly as David explained his resignation, then surprised him by saying, "About time someone recognized your worth, Martinez. You were always meant for more than just driving a cab." Later that night, as David helped his mother with her evening medications, she pointed to the leather folder still sitting on the table. "You know what Anna would say about all this, don't you?" David smiled, remembering his wife's favorite saying. Together with his mother, they spoke the words that had guided them through so many difficult times. God never closes a door without opening a window. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere out there, a little girl named Emma slept peacefully under Anna's quilt, while her mother dared to hope for better days ahead. David Martinez, no longer just a taxi driver, but now a man with a mission, felt ready to step through that open window into whatever tomorrow might bring. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness. For David, that journey was just beginning. The next 6 months transformed David's life in ways he never could have imagined. The Thompson Foundation's offices became his second home, though it took him weeks to get used to having his own desk with a nameplate that read, Director of Transportation Services. Every morning, as he rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, he would touch the small photo of Anna he kept in his wallet, a ritual that helped him remember why he was here. His first major project was creating a comprehensive transportation network for the Foundation's families. Drawing on his decades of experience, David mapped out the most efficient routes to every major hospital and treatment center in Chicago. He knew which streets to avoid during rush hour, which shortcuts could save precious minutes during an emergency, and most importantly, which drivers could be trusted with the Foundation's most vulnerable passengers. "You've revolutionized our entire approach," Dr. Thompson told him one afternoon, reviewing the statistics from his first quarter. The numbers were impressive. Wait times for rides had been cut in half, and family satisfaction rates had soared to nearly perfect scores. But it was the handwritten thank you notes piling up on David's desk that meant the most to him. One particular case stood out in his memory. A single father named James had been struggling to get his son Tommy to weekly chemotherapy appointments while holding down 2 jobs. David not only arranged reliable transportation, but also coordinated the schedule to match James's work hours. When Tommy finished his last treatment 3 months later, his father broke down crying in David's office. "You didn't just help us get to the hospital," James had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped us keep our dignity. You gave us hope." The Foundation's transportation program expanded rapidly under David's leadership. He hired and trained a team of specialized drivers, many of them former taxi drivers he'd known from his previous life. Each one was carefully selected not just for their driving skills, but for their capacity to understand and support families in crisis. "Remember," he would tell them during training sessions, "you're not just driving a car, you're carrying precious cargo. Someone's whole world is in your backseat. Treat them like they're your own family." His mother's health improved significantly once she started receiving proper medical care through his new insurance. The tremors were still there, but the new medications helped control them better. She began volunteering at the Foundation twice a week, greeting families in the lobby and sharing her famous empanadas with children waiting for their rides. Sarah and Emma became regular fixtures in his life. Emma's treatments were showing promising results, and her bright laugh could often be heard echoing through the foundation's hallways. She still cherished Anna's quilt, now promoted from a simple blanket to her official magic cape that she wore to every treatment session. One rainy Tuesday morning, David received an unexpected visit from Mr. Chen, his former employer at the taxi company. The old man stood awkwardly in David's office, taking in the view of the city from the large windows. "I have a proposition," Mr. Chen said finally. "Many of my drivers, they struggle like you used to, but this program you've built here, it gives purpose, better pay, better hours. Perhaps we could work together?" That conversation led to a partnership between the foundation and several local taxi companies, creating a network of trained medical transport drivers who could serve both regular passengers and foundation families. It was a win-win situation that helped both the drivers and the families they served. David's innovative approach caught the attention of other organizations. Soon, children's hospitals in neighboring states began reaching out, wanting to implement similar programs. Dr. Thompson encouraged him to share his expertise, and before he knew it, David was giving presentations about the transportation program's success. "You're not just changing lives in Chicago anymore," Dr. Thompson told him after one such presentation. "You're creating a model that could help families across the country." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 months into his new role. Sarah knocked on his office door one evening, holding Emma's hand. The little girl's hair was starting to grow back, a fuzzy, dark halo around her smiling face. "We got the results today," Sarah said, happy tears in her eyes. "The cancer is in remission, and we wanted you to be one of the first to know because, She paused, squeezing Emma's hand. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night." Emma stepped forward, still wrapped in Anna's quilt, and handed David a crayon drawing. It showed a taxi with wings floating above the Chicago skyline. Written in wobbly letters across the top were the words, "My guardian angel driver." That evening, as David drove home in his new company car, a far cry from his old taxi, he took the long route past his old regular spots, the diner where Anna used to bring him coffee, the hospital where he'd first met Sarah and Emma, the streets he'd driven for so many years. Each place held memories, but they no longer felt heavy with sadness. Instead, they were reminders of how a single moment of kindness could ripple out and transform not just one life, but many. At a red light, he glanced at Emma's drawing on the passenger seat and smiled. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes in life come disguised as the smallest choices, and sometimes, a simple taxi ride could be the beginning of something extraordinary. 1 year to the day after that fateful taxi ride, the Thompson Foundation's main conference room was transformed for a special celebration. The long table where David had first received his life-changing offer had been pushed aside to make room for dozens of chairs. Photographs lined the walls. Smiling families, dedicated drivers, successful partnerships, and countless moments of hope captured over the past year. At the center of it all hangs a framed taxi driver's license, David's old one, now a symbol of how far he'd come. Beside it was Emma's crayon drawing of the winged taxi, professionally framed and becoming something of a mascot for the Foundation's transportation program. The room buzzed with conversation as people filed in, many faces familiar to David now, others new, but all connected by the threads of compassion and community that had been woven over the past year. "Can I have everyone's attention?" Dr. Thompson's voice carried across the room. The crowd quieted, turning toward where she stood next to David. 1 year ago today, a taxi driver made a simple choice that would change countless lives. Today, we're here to celebrate. Not just that choice, but all the choices that have followed. David shifted uncomfortably in his new suit. He was still getting used to wearing one. As Dr. Thompson continued, his mother sat in the front row, her tremors noticeably reduced thanks to the advanced treatment she now received, beaming with pride. Next to her sat Mr. Chen, who had become an invaluable partner in expanding the transportation program. "In just 1 year," Dr. Thompson announced, Our transportation program has served over 500 families, logged more than 50,000 miles, and created partnerships with 15 taxi companies across 3 states. But numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is in the lives touched, the burdens lifted, and the hope restored. Sarah stepped forward then, holding Emma's hand. The little girl's hair had grown back fully, dark curls framing her healthy, glowing face. She still carried Anna's quilt, though now it was more of a comfort object than a necessity. "I'd like to share something," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "1 year ago, I was at my lowest point. My daughter was sick, I was alone, and I couldn't even afford a taxi ride home. But then David stopped, and he did more than just give us a ride. He showed us that we weren't alone. That kindness still exists in the world." She paused, gathering herself. "Today, I'm not just a grateful mother. I'm proud to announce that the Foundation is expanding our parent support program, and I'll be leading it." The room erupted in applause. David felt his eyes growing moist as he remembered that cold night, that desperate mother and sick child who had changed his life as much as he had changed theirs. "But there's more," Dr. Thompson interjected once the applause died down. "David's transportation program model is being adopted by children's hospitals in 5 other major cities. What started as one act of kindness has grown into a movement." She gestured to the back of the room, where a group of people in uniform stood, the first graduating class of the Foundation's specialized driver training program. Many were former taxi drivers, others were new to the field, but all had been inspired by David's story. "Each of these drivers has completed over 100 hours of training," David explained, finding his voice. "They're not just drivers. They're caregivers, confidants, and sometimes even angels in disguise." He smiled at Emma, who giggled at their private joke about the winged taxi. His mother stood then, steady despite her condition, and spoke with the wisdom of years. "My son's father was a taxi driver," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "He always said that every passenger has a story, and every ride is a chance to be part of that story. Today we see how true that is." The celebration continued, but David found himself drawn to the window, looking out over the city he'd driven for so many years. From this height, he could see the hospital where it all began, the streets he'd navigated countless times, the flow of life below that continued day after day. A small hand slipped into his, Emma still carrying the quilt that had once belonged to Anna. "Do you think your wife can see all this?" she asked innocently. David knelt down to her level, touching the soft fabric of the quilt. "I think she can," he said softly. "And I think she's very happy about how her quilt found its way to you." "It's not just a quilt anymore," Emma declared seriously. "It's a symbol of hope. And that's what Mom says." Looking around the room at all the lives touched, all the changes set in motion by one simple choice on a cold Chicago night, David couldn't help but agree. The quilt, like his old taxi, had become something more. A reminder that the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways we never expect. As the celebration wound down, Dr. Thompson presented David with a special gift, a new nameplate for his office that read David Martinez, Director of Hope Transportation. It made him laugh, even as it brought tears to his eyes. "Sometimes," he said in a short speech, "the best destinations aren't places on a map. They're moments when we realize we're exactly where we're meant to be, doing exactly what we're meant to do." The sun was setting over Chicago as the party ended, painting the sky in the same colors it had shown on that fateful night 1 year ago. But now, David Martinez watched it not from behind a taxi wheel, but from a place he never could have imagined, surrounded by family, friends, and the profound knowledge that sometimes the longest journeys begin with a single act of kindness. 3 years after that life-changing taxi ride, David Martinez stood at the window of his corner office in the Thompson Foundation's new transportation center. The Chicago skyline stretched before him, the same view he'd seen thousands of times from behind his taxi wheel. But now it told a different story, Each street below held memories of lives touched, hopes restored, and journeys that went far beyond simple transportation. The Foundation's transportation program had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. What started as one man's act of kindness had blossomed into a nationwide movement, with similar programs operating in 27 major cities across the country. The simple model David had developed, treating every ride as an opportunity to provide comfort and hope, had revolutionized how medical institutions approached patient transportation. On his desk sat a framed newspaper article from the Chicago Tribune. From taxi driver to transportation innovation leader. How one man's kindness transformed medical transportation. Next to it was Emma's original crayon drawing of the winged taxi, now the official logo of the Thompson Foundation's Hope Rides program. The childish lines had been professionally redesigned, but they kept the original's heartfelt simplicity, a reminder of where it all began. David's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. She was in Boston, launching their newest regional center. Emma, now healthy and thriving at 11, had given a speech at the opening ceremony, telling their story from her perspective. "You should have seen her," Sarah's message read. She still had Anna's quilt wrapped around her shoulders like a cape while she spoke. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. The quilt had become more than just a comfort object. It was a symbol that had inspired an entire movement. The Foundation now provided similar quilts to every child in their program, each one handmade by volunteers, many of whom were cancer survivors or their families. They called them Anna's Angels, and each quilt came with a small card telling the story of a taxi driver's kindness and his late wife's legacy of love. David's mother, Maria, had become an integral part of this initiative. Despite her Parkinson's, she supervised the quilt-making program 3 days a week. The tremors in her hands had worsened with age, but she'd found that working with the volunteers gave her purpose. "Every stitch carries a prayer," she would say, watching the quilters work. "Just like every ride carries hope." The transportation center's ground floor housed what the staff affectionately called Chen's Academy. Mr. Chen had retired from the taxi business, selling his company to help fund the Foundation's driver training program. Now he spent his days teaching new drivers not just the rules of the road, but the art of compassionate service. The program had become so successful that there was a waiting list of drivers wanting to join. Being a Hope Rides driver isn't just a job, Chen would tell his trainees. It's a calling. We're not just driving people to hospitals. We're carrying their dreams, their fears, their hopes for tomorrow. The impact of the program reached far beyond the immediate families they served. Local businesses had started supporting their efforts. Hotels near major hospitals offered discounted rates to Hope Rides families. Restaurants provided meals. Other taxi companies followed Mr. Chen's lead, creating their own specialized medical transport divisions. One of David's proudest achievements was the Emergency Night Ride program, inspired by his original encounter with Sarah and Emma. Available 24/7, it ensured that no family would ever be stranded at a hospital, regardless of their ability to pay. The program had already helped over 10,000 families, each with their own story of hope and healing. James Peterson, who'd been at that first meeting when David was hired, now headed the Foundation's national expansion efforts. "You know what makes this program different?" he'd asked during a recent board meeting. "It's not just about getting from point A to point B. It's about treating every journey as sacred, every passenger as family." The Foundation had also established the Ana Martinez Memorial Scholarship, providing financial support to families struggling with medical transportation costs. The first recipient had been a young mother named Rosa, whose situation eerily paralleled Sarah's that fateful night. When David presented her with the scholarship certificate, Rosa hugged him and whispered, "Angels still drive taxis in Chicago." The program's success had attracted attention from medical institutions worldwide. David found himself traveling frequently, speaking at conferences and helping other organizations implement similar programs. He'd recently returned from London, where the National Health Service was adopting a modified version of the Hope Rides model. But of all the lives touched by the program, few transformations were as profound as David's own. The quiet, struggling taxi driver had found his true calling. His understanding of both the practical and emotional aspects of medical transportation made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between medical institutions and the families they served. Emma's recovery had been particularly meaningful to everyone involved. She'd become the Foundation's unofficial ambassador, joining David at events and sharing their story. The little girl who'd once been too weak to walk now bounded through the Foundation's halls, bringing energy and joy wherever she went. She'd started a support group for other kids in treatment, teaching them to see their hospital visits as hero journeys rather than hardships. Sarah's role had evolved too. As the National Director of Family Support Services, she'd developed comprehensive support programs that went beyond transportation. Support groups, counseling services, and practical assistance programs helped families navigate the challenging journey of childhood illness. Her professional background as a grief counselor, combined with her personal experience, made her uniquely qualified to understand and address families' needs. One particularly touching moment had come during the Foundation's annual gala. A procession of vehicles had parked outside the venue, taxi drivers, both past and present, who'd been inspired by David's story. Each car bore the winged taxi logo, and each driver had their own story of how the program had changed their perspective on their profession. David's old taxi company had been transformed as well. Under new management, one of David's former colleagues, it had become a model for socially conscious transportation services. They still ran regular taxi services, but their specialized medical transport division, staffed by graduates of Chen's Academy, had become their proudest achievement. The Foundation's reach extended into unexpected areas. Local medical schools now included modules on compassionate transportation in their patient care programs. Social workers collaborated with the transportation team to ensure comprehensive support for families. Even city planning committees consulted with them about making Chicago more accessible for families dealing with medical challenges. Maria Martinez's health had stabilized thanks to advanced treatments covered by David's insurance. Though she couldn't cook as much as she used to, her empanadas were still legendary among the Foundation's families. She taught her recipes to the cafeteria staff, ensuring that her legacy of comfort food would continue to support families in need. One evening, as David was preparing to leave the office, he found Emma waiting by his car in the parking garage. Now, old enough to understand the full significance of that night 3 years ago, she had a question that touched his heart. "Mr. David," she said, Anna's quilt still draped around her shoulders despite her age, "do you believe in destiny? Mom says that night wasn't just a chance, that angels brought you to us." David looked at the young girl who had played such a pivotal role in transforming his life. "I believe," he said carefully, "that every moment gives us a choice. That night, I chose kindness. Your mother chose trust. And together, we all chose hope." Emma nodded sagely. "The quilt chose me," she said with the simple wisdom of children. "And now it helps me choose other people who need it." As David drove home that evening, taking the long route past the hospital where it all began, he reflected on how a single act of kindness had rippled out to touch so many lives. The streets he'd once driven in solitude and struggle now told a different story, a story of hope, community, and the profound impact of compassion. The Thompson Foundation's transportation program continued to grow, spreading hope one ride at a time. And somewhere in Chicago, a simple quilt still brought comfort to those who needed it most, carrying forward Anna's legacy of love and David's message of compassion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.